Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm Tomas Morales. I chair the Adult Education Board of the church, and I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rafik Mohamed, Claremont resident, by the way, and also a member of the Claremont Police Commission. Is that correct, Rafik? Is that the right?
That is correct, yeah.
Yep. Great citizen. Let me give you a brief introduction to Rafik, and this is a very timely discussion because ethnic studies has been in the news, and critical race theory and its mischaracterization in the media. So this is indeed a very timely topic. Dr. Rafik Mohamed became the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at California State University, San Bernardino in July 2015. And as someone who's completing his 15th year as a president of a university, Rafik is at the top of that list in terms of best hires that I've made as a president or a provost. He holds a BA in sociology and criminal justice from George Washington University and an MA in social ecology and Ph.D. in criminology, law and society from the University of California at Irvine. Yes, he's an anteater. Mohamed's research has focused on domestic drug policy, sports, sociology, and issues of racial identity and inequality in the United States. His most recent book, titled Black Men on the Blacktop, Basketball and the Politics of Race, tells a story about race in its peculiarly American context and about how the politics of race and resistance are mediated through sports. Without further ado, I'll introduce Rafik Mohamed to you all. Rafik, thank you for being here.
Thank you, President Morales, and thank you everybody else. Thank you, Pastor, for allowing me to come, and thanks everybody else for participating. It's my pleasure to be here, and I am right up the hill in Claremont, and anyway, I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. President Morales asked if I could come talk about AB 1460, Assembly Bill 1460, and ethnic studies education. And I'm happy to do that. I've been just a little bit more background with respect to me and ethnic studies. I began as a professor at the University of San Diego back in 1999. And one of the things I was hired to do there, even though my background isn't formally ethnic studies in terms of my training, was I was brought in to teach in sociology and develop their law and society curriculum, but then also they asked if I would be interested in helping develop their ethnic studies curriculum there at University of San Diego. So I've been involved in developing and teaching ethnic studies classes for most of my career, at least my teaching career. And so and I think President Morales was spot on in that a lot of what ethnic studies has been distorted, particularly in recent conversations, political conversations around, and the politicization of things like critical race theory and things like that. And I'm happy at the end to kind of make a distinction between ethnic studies and critical race theory and things like that, if you'd like. But to get things started, I figured I wanted to just offer some context and perspective in terms of where I'm, kind of where I'm coming from in all of this. And so hopefully I'm trying to advance the slide. I didn't know animation was in here. Okay, here we go. Just again, around the politics, this is something that was said in response to the passage of AB 101, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. But it's a quote from Tammy Rossman Benjamin, who writes, "Ethnic studies is not a discipline, it's political activism. It's training students to be foot soldiers. It goes against everything real education stands for, and it's dividing the world into us and them." I disagree with her statement, and I guess I'm gonna share why. And in order to do this, I'm going to share with you, if you'll indulge me, something I've only read publicly twice before. Once for this. This is something I wrote. I was asked to speak at our CSUSB Black graduation in 2016, and these are my remarks to the students who were graduating at that time, just to kind of give you to lead into ethnic studies. So if you'll indulge me, I'll read this and then I'll get back to some other stuff. But it begins. When considering what I might say to you, two things immediately came to mind. First, I thought of what was going on around me when I sat in your shoes 24 years ago. I lived in DC at the time, and I was preparing to move to Los Angeles, which was still smoldering from the riots following the acquittals of 4 police officers charged with beating Rodney King. The war on drugs was unapologetically in full swing, sending young Black men to prison at rates grossly disproportionate to their representation in the population. And the era's hip hop soundtrack, the soundtrack of my youth, suggested rather clearly that Black lives didn't matter, at least not as much as the lives of others. The second thing that came to mind was an email I received in November 2008. It read, "Dear Dr. Mohamed, I hope that you're doing well. I don't know if you remember me, but I was a student in your Introduction to Sociology course in the fall of 2004. It was an election year, and during one class, we were discussing race and ethnicity. I recall you saying that you fully expected to see a woman elected president in your lifetime. But you said, because of the United States' deep history of racial inequality, you were saddened but certain that America would not elect a Black president during your lifetime. I just wanted to know how you feel right now. Sincerely, the student." I remembered the student, and I wrote her back that day sharing exactly how I felt on the night of November 4th, 2008. I had a class that evening that I team taught with a colleague named Leva. As we did after every class, Leva and I went out to grab some dinner. Only this evening's dinner had added significance because it was election night and Barack Obama was the Democratic nominee for president. Leva and I decided to go to a local restaurant that we knew had a bar area with TVs so that we could watch the night's election results as they came in. Within 10 minutes of sitting down, California was called in favor of Senator Obama, and moments later, the election was called, declaring Barack Obama the next president of the United States. Leva started freaking out. "Can you believe it? Can you believe it?" I'm a little more stoic than that, and I just sat there in quiet contemplation. A couple of seats away, there was a 30-something white couple sitting at a high-top table. I don't know if it's because I'm a sociologist or because I grew up in DC back when it was the nation's murder capital. Maybe I'm just nosy, but I typically pay attention to what's going on around me when I'm in public places. When Senator Obama was declared the victor, the woman at the high-top table sank her head into her hands and began sobbing, "No, no, no," like the world had just ended. Her partner, also visibly dismayed, consoled her. For different reasons, I'm sure, I was also stunned by the outcome of the election. I gave up on dinner and decided just to head home. At the time, I rented a small apartment about 10 minutes away in Mission Beach. And for those of you who don't know, Mission Beach is a predominantly white San Diego community with a mix of old surfers, college students, and well-off gentrifiers. After finding a parking spot several blocks away from my apartment, I got out of my car, and the first thing I noticed were the sounds of celebration. It seemed like there was a huge block party in Mission Beach and someone forgot to invite me. But the dark of night allowed me to glance into the windows of the 1- and 2-story apartment buildings that typify Mission Beach. Window after window, all I saw were lots of people, white people in full-on celebration mode. They were partying for Obama. I got to my apartment and went inside. I didn't turn the lights on. I just found the couch, sat, and listened to the sounds of celebration mixed with waves crashing on the nearby beach. And then like that woman in the bar, in the dark, I started to cry. I've never told anyone that part of the story before. I'm a man and I don't cry. I'm from that don't make me give you something to cry about generation. That's how my parents raised me, and that's how society raised me. But on this night in 2008, in the darkness of my Mission Beach apartment, with the sounds of white folks celebrating America's first Black president echoing off the apartments all around me, I couldn't help myself. Believe me, I was happy that I was wrong in 2004 and that Obama won, but these weren't tears of joy. When the impossible happened, when the majority of voting Americans decided to put historically rooted prejudices behind us and elect a Black man as leader of the free world, my mind immediately went to my grandmother, Cynthia D'Aguilar Brown. She was born in 1910 in Kingston, Jamaica, a former sugar colony that enslaved Africans made the crown jewel of the British Empire. In 1920, Jamaica was still under British colonial rule, and my 10-year-old grandmother immigrated by boat to Harlem, just her and her brother. I'll spare you her whole wonderful biography, but I'll summarize by saying that my grandmother was an incredible woman who against a lot of odds earned a master's degree, became a math teacher, spending almost all of her 40-year career teaching in legally segregated Maryland and DC public schools, and lost more than one job because she fought tirelessly for the right of Black children to receive a quality education and for Black teachers to receive equal pay to their white counterparts. My grandmother died in 2001, shortly after her 91st birthday. So I sat there on my couch on election night in 2008, thinking about her, sad that she didn't live to see that day, and wondering if she and the tens of thousands of folks like her who put their fundamental belief in equality ahead of their personal comfort and safety would ever know that their efforts weren't in vain. Would they ever know that maybe, just maybe, America had the capacity to move beyond its original sin? I'm sharing this story with you because but for people like them, we wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be here, President Obama wouldn't be closing out his second term, none of that. And it's therefore incumbent upon us to protect their legacy and ensure that we always remain aware that we can't just unconsciously go through life thinking that it's only about us. Take a look around you, not in this room, but at the society around you. Even though we've come a long way since I sat where you are today, we cannot afford unconsciousness. Many of the same issues I was observing in 1992 remain clearly and painfully unresolved. Instead of the spotlight being on Los Angeles, it's now Ferguson, Baltimore, Miami, and New York. Instead of it being Rodney King or Prince Jones, it's now Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and certainly, sadly, someone to be named later. I recently read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's a tragically beautiful memoir-like open letter to his 15-year-old son about growing up Black in America. In the book, Coates tells his son, "I'm speaking to you as I always have, as the sober and serious man I have always wanted you to be, who does not apologize for his human feelings, who does not make excuses for his height, his long arms, his beautiful smile. You are growing into consciousness, and my wish for you is that you feel no need to constrict yourself to make other people feel comfortable. None of that can change the truth anyway. I never wanted you to be twice as good as them, so much as I have always wanted you to attack every day of your brief life in struggle. I would not have you descend into your own dream. I would have you be a conscious citizen of this terrible and beautiful world." And so those were, I mean, I said a little bit more, but that's essentially what I said to the Black graduation in 2016. And I just want to highlight a couple of things from that and then go on into ethnic studies. But you know, I don't consider myself any kind of prophet, but I was fairly certain that there would be other folks that would you know, suffer inequality at the hands of the criminal justice system and other instances like Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, and Michael Brown and folks like that. And I never foresaw, you know, the George Floyd moment that we had in 2020, and I have some more thoughts on that later. But essentially, you know, in my mind, this is what ethnic studies is about. There's a former Berkeley historian, he passed a couple of years ago, Ron Takaki, who argued that ethnic studies is about looking at the American experience in what he called a different mirror. And he argued that ethnic studies is about using education to facilitate a more complete awareness of who we are and how we got here. In his book, A Different Mirror, Takaki tells a story about a cab ride that he took in Virginia. And he writes, "I had flown from San Francisco to Norfolk, and I was riding in a taxi to my hotel to attend a conference on multiculturalism. My driver and I chatted about the weather and the tourists. The rearview mirror reflected a white man in his 40s. How long have you been here? How long have you been in this country?" he asked. "All of my life," I replied, wincing. "I was born in the United States." With a strong Southern drawl, he remarked, "I was wondering because your English is excellent." Then, as I had many times before, I explained, "My grandfather came here from Japan in the 1880s. My family has been here in America for over 100 years. And so people like Takaki's grandfather, my grandmother, or my maternal grandfather, whose forefathers came to Virginia on slave ships, have been left out of the story we tell about ourselves because it contradicts these kind of more convenient stories we prefer to tell. these, what this woman, Evelyn Hudhart, referred to as these triumphalist assumptions of how we got here today. And by that, she means that the history of the United States is just an unbroken series of us getting better and triumphs. And it overlooks kind of some of the dirty or inconvenient or uncomfortable aspects of our past and our truth. Takaki and others in ethnic studies argue that the history we continue to tell of America has largely been monolithic in its perspective. It's been a history that's privileged a few groups and left out or distorted the stories of many more. Again, quoting Takaki, he writes, "The cab driver had a narrow but widely shared sense of the past, a history that has viewed America as European in ancestry. But America has been defined as white. But America has been racially diverse since our very beginning on the Virginia shore." Ultimately, at the heart of ethnic studies is the insistence that multicultural education is essential for us to gain a better understanding of who we are and where we are as Americans and as people who have come to this place. So with that said, I want to transition to the text of California Assembly Bill 1460. AB 1460 is the ethnic studies graduation requirement for the CSU. I scratch my head sometimes and wonder why it only applies to the CSU, but that's neither here nor there. But here you can see the text of the bill, which is that commencing with students graduating in the 2024-2025 academic year, the CSU shall require as an undergraduate graduation requirement the completion of, at minimum, 1 3-unit course in ethnic studies. And they drill down to be a little bit more specific. And this also was a bit of I don't want to say a point of controversy, but a point of discussion with respect to how this bill took shape. It focuses specifically on, or the courses have to focus specifically on one of 4 groups: Native American studies, African American studies, Asian American studies, or Latina studies. The bill goes on to say it's the intent of the legislature that the students of California State University acquire the knowledge and skills that will help them comprehend the diversity and social justice history of the United States and of the society in which they live, to enable them to contribute to that society as responsible and constructive citizens. So the sense of awareness that understanding more holistically who we are is going to help us move forward as a state and as a country. And ultimately, the last requirement is commencing with the 2021-2022 academic year, the California State University shall provide for courses in ethnic studies at each of its campuses. And so, as President Morales, I'm sure, can attest, campuses across the system were scrambling to fulfill this requirement in timely fashion. Fortunately for our campus, we already had a core of courses in ethnic studies and didn't have to worry about the 2021-2022 requirement. However, we did really have to ramp up our ethnic studies offerings to ensure that we're ready for 2024-2025. And I'm happy to tell you later about how we managed to do that. AB 1460, however, was not met without resistance, including from the CSU. And in fact, the California State University system office, the chancellor's office, opposed AB 1460, and the academic senate of the California State University opposed AB 1460. If I'm not mistaken, the California Faculty Association, which is the union that represents all of the faculty in the CSU, were actually in favor of 1460, but the CSU itself and the Senate opposed it. And the basis for the opposition was different from what was on the first slide. It wasn't necessarily concern over indoctrinating students or things like that. At least the stated opposition was because they argued it amounted to legislative overreach. This is actually tied to the third bullet point there, which is that the CSU should be able to control its own curriculum. The CSU and the individual campuses should be able to control its own curriculum, and that shouldn't be dictated necessarily by the state legislature. And there are lots of examples across the country of how that can be problematic. In fact, if you look at what the kind of arguments around critical race theory of late, you have a lot of state legislatures actually that are that have passed laws banning the teaching of what I would call ethnic studies, but what they're characterizing as critical race theory. So I understand that argument that you don't necessarily want the legislature too heavily handed in kind of the educational affairs, specifically of universities and systems. The other reason that the CSU opposed it was just cost. They estimated that it would cost about $16.5 million to implement the new requirement. And I think, as you all know, given we still haven't fully recovered from the Great Recession in the CSU, and the COVID pandemic had devastating impacts to our operating budget over the past couple of years. And so cost concerns are certainly real and relevant. In response to AB 1460, the CSU proposed its own ethnic studies requirement that would have included social justice courses and classes that explored history of other groups of people, not limited to Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, such as Muslims, Jews, and LGBTQ people. So that was the counter argument that the CSU made, or the counter offer the CSU made. Ultimately, that was rejected, and AB 1460 passed. Also related to this is AB 101, which is a high school graduation requirement, which was passed, was signed into law by Governor Newsom in October 2021. And AB 101 adds the completion of a one-semester course in ethnic studies to the California high school graduation requirements, beginning with students who will be graduating in 2029, 2030. The other interesting thing about AB 101 is it also applies to pupils enrolled in charter schools. So they have to also include an ethnic studies course. And school districts and charter schools can go beyond the one semester requirement to extend it to a year if they like. And ultimately, this kicks in 2025, 2026. And once again, there was opposition to AB 101, and the tone of the opposition is similar to opposition that I started the talk with, but also just that's kind of happening across the country. There were 14 different organizations that opposed AB 101, and this was an excerpt from this is an excerpt from their joint statement. They argue the discipline is firmly, referring to ethnic studies, the discipline is firmly rooted in neo-Marxist ideologies that divide society into oppressed and oppressor groups based primarily on race. And as part of its disciplinary mission, uses the classroom to indoctrinate students into narrow political beliefs and political activism. Pursuing a narrow political framework in education is divisive, discriminatory, and inflammatory. A victim-oppressor lens takes away empowerment, personal agency, and incentives from the so-called victim group, while viciously scapegoating and stereotyping the privileged groups through the narrow prism of race. Such classes can't help but promote hatred and bigotry in California classrooms and are wholly inappropriate for our students. So that was what they submitted to the legislature and government in opposition, and governor in opposition to AB 101. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about what ethnic studies is and where it came from. Ethnic studies, this is actually from the text of AB 1460, these 3 bullet points. And I could certainly tell you more about the origins later if you'd like. But on November 6, 1968, a coalition of student groups at San Francisco State University in the CSU demanded that the university institute an ethnic studies program. And so the first college of ethnic studies was actually brought online at San Francisco State in 1969. And I want to say it was Cal State LA that actually developed the first department of Chicano studies right around that same time as well. In terms of what ethnic studies focuses on, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and some of it, is warranted to some extent, but I think most of it's not. But ethnic studies are an interdisciplinary and comparative study of race and ethnicity with special focus on 4 historically defined racialized core groups: Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos. What some research has shown, and I think the majority of research has shown actually, that both students of color and white students benefit academically as well as socially from taking ethnic studies courses. Again, the point of ethnic studies is this idea that we tell a more complete picture. We look at society in a different mirror. We tell a more complete picture of who we are and where we came from. Ethnic studies seeks to explore what's been left out of the American explaining story. And I'll stop there and just give you a really quick example. I went to good public schools. I went to the George, as President Morales said in my introduction, I went to the George Washington University as an undergraduate. I majored initially in accounting, but I changed majors to sociology with a minor in political science and criminal justice. because I was really concerned about what was happening around me in DC at that time. The only time in all of, oh, and I'll take a step back. In high school, I was always in AP honors, history classes, and English classes. The only time that the first time rather, that I heard of Japanese internment, as just one example, where we as the United States forcibly removed 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 70% of whom were American citizens by birth, from the West Coast and sent them into concentration camps, which all throughout the West. And I say concentration camps specifically. I had a great professor for whom I TA'd when I was a graduate student, who made the distinction between concentration camps and death camps. And he said, in talking about Nazi Germany, he said that those weren't concentration camps; they were death camps. And we all know the 6 million Jewish people who perished as a result of that. So in any case, we rounded up 110,000 people, sent them to these internment camps without any due process, under the auspices of national security. Ultimately, 4 years later, they were released from the internment camps, those that made it out, and they never got any of their property back. The same person I used to TA for once said the dissertation has yet to be written about what happened to all of their property. They lost 90% of their wealth, of their property. In any case, I hadn't heard about that. The only time I heard about that was I took a constitutional law class, and I read the case Korematsu v. U.S., which is a 1944 U.S. Supreme Court case with the petitioner Fred Korematsu, who brought it before the court, arguing that internment was unconstitutional, and the Supreme Court held that it was perfectly constitutional. And in fact, they never overturned that case. Later on, they apologized for it, but they never overturned it. In any case, so things like that, I think, are critical to our understanding of who we are and how we got here. And if I fast forward to, for example, September 11th, people were proposing very similar types of structures to what we saw in World War II, with Executive Order 9066 and this registry of Japanese Americans. People were asking for the same thing with respect to Muslim Americans, and it was this complete ignorance of what we had done in the past, I think, that was helping to fuel that we didn't learn from that past. So ethnic studies is about exploring what's been left out of the American explaining story, drawing attention to different histories, gaining an understanding of privilege. And I know privilege is one of these words that's lightning rod, but ultimately privilege just refers to unearned statuses based on, unearned assets based on particular statuses that you occupy. And whenever I used to teach ethnic studies, I used to begin talking about male privilege. And talk about the advantages that I have is just from the accident of birth, the Supreme Court said in one case, by being a man. And how, as a faculty member, for example, people don't ask the same things of me as they do, for example, of my female counterparts. And I can happily talk about that later as well. Ethnic studies is also about exploring how we came to understand race and ethnicity and empower race and ethnicity in the United States. And it's also ultimately exploring the possibility and viability of us truly becoming post-racial. I think one of the things that we heard, certainly in response to the election of President Obama, was, oh, now we're here, we've arrived, we're post-racial. And I think, the incidents that we've seen with Charlottesville, with George Floyd's murder, with January 6th, suggest that that's not true, right? And so ethnic studies does try to get at this idea of moving past race ultimately, but in order to move past it, we have to fully understand it. People often ask, is it necessary? Don't we already understand these things? Don't we already teach these things? Aren't kids already exposed to this in the curriculum? And as I was just talking about with respect to my own education, and certainly that was a while ago, right? We aren't. In fact, if you look at what's going on legislatively, as I already said, in response to this, kind of critical race theory red herring, we are pushing back on being more inclusive in what we teach in terms of the history of the country. But it goes beyond ethnic studies. I read this article years ago. I used to teach this article called Citizen Stupid, which was basically a laundry list of the things that we don't know. And the author, Alan Wolf, writes, Americans may be divided by party, but they are united in ignorance. And these data points I actually pulled yesterday for the purpose of this. and I'll tell you, some of these statistics are much improved, and I'll show you in a second how that is. But only 51% of Americans can name all three branches of government. Fewer than half know that we're the only country ever to have dropped a nuclear weapon. 52%, and this is from 2018, couldn't name a single Supreme Court justice. And this is after Kavanaugh was nominated to the court to replace Kennedy, who was retiring under the Trump administration. 52% couldn't name one justice. And from the Pew Research Institute in 2021, roughly a quarter of Americans didn't read a book in whole or in part in the past year, whether in print, electronic, or audio form. We are for all of the privilege that we have as a country relative to other places, we are woefully ignorant of even who we are. And I don't mean that as a value judgment. I mean that as just, an objective statement of fact. Here's just a little bit more data. I'm a sociologist and I'll throw data at you. But a percentage of people who can't name three branches of government, Annenberg does this survey every year. And so if you notice that we've actually gotten a lot better in the past several years with respect to being able to name all three branches of government. But look at where we were just in 2016, where a quarter of Americans couldn't name all three branches of government, and over 30% couldn't name a single branch of government. I'll talk about why that's changed in just a second. A percentage of respondents who can name rights guaranteed by the First Amendment. So this is just a list of the rights that are the core rights in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, and how many people couldn't name from 2017 to 2021 any single right in the First Amendment. So, for example, in 2017, only 15% could name that freedom of religion as a fundamental right in the First Amendment, and so on and so on. And you see again in 2021, we see this vast improvement in terms of why that is. Just to continue for a second, actually, I'll opine on that for just a second. What people have suggested is that one of the latent effects of the Trump administration and the kind of political fervor that surrounded the last 4 years, and I'm not trying to politicize this, I'm just trying to is that people paid more attention to the basic functions of government. So they became more aware of and in response to George Floyd, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and what the limitations of all that were. So some of the the upshot, I guess, of some of the more tragic moments of the last 4 or 5 years has been people's civic awareness has increased. The Woodrow Wilson Foundation, I have a little asterisk up there because Woodrow Wilson was pro-segregation and stuff like that. However, they do a citizenship test every year where they take the questions that are on the U.S. citizenship exam. So if you're trying to become a naturalized citizen to the United States, you have to take this test. And so some of the sample questions are: what's the supreme law of the land? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? Name one branch of government. How many U.S. senators are there? If the president can no longer serve, who becomes president? In what month do we vote for president? What territory did the U.S. buy from France in 1803? So these are things that if you want to be a citizen, you need to know in order to pass a citizenship exam. And every year, the Wilson Foundation randomly samples U.S. citizens and gives them the exam, and only 36% in 2018 could pass the citizenship exam with a score of 60 plus. Only 13% knew when the Constitution was ratified, and 57% did not know a single justice on the Supreme Court. They couldn't name a single justice in 2018. The point there is Americans are ill-informed about a lot of things, but none, in my view, has been as enduring as misunderstandings about race and ethnicity and where we've come from and how we got here. We have been dominated, at least in my lifetime, with this narrative of a level playing field and fundamental equality, and America kind of becoming a steadily better place with respect to race and ethnicity and moving beyond the original sin. And while I don't disagree that we are in a better place, my mother grew up in segregation in Washington, D.C., which was legally segregated at that time. My mother, as I often say, she never went to school with a white person, and it wasn't that she didn't like white people. She just wasn't by law allowed to attend the white schools, even though there was a white school much closer to her house than the all-black school that was 7 blocks away. And so, so we're better off in that regard in terms of legal segregation and things like that. But there have been lots of studies done, particularly around the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. So that was a while ago, but they did lots of studies on school segregation, just as an example, and found that schools were as segregated in 2004 as they were in 1954. And that remains the same now. So we are ill-informed about a lot of things. And none has been as enduring as race and ethnicity. I think, one of our moments of reckoning was tragically in 2020 when George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin. And I read this article recently by Jennifer Wrightson in The Atlantic, where she talks and she writes, for 2 days in early June, as America was erupting in sustained protests over the killing of a Black man, George Floyd, by police in Minneapolis, the most watched movie on Netflix was The Help. To ask what was going on here, why people started watching The Help at a moment of deep racial trauma, is to risk tumbling down a rabbit hole. One reality that The Help phenomenon makes us recognize is the enduring power of mythology when it comes to American racism. The mythology takes many forms. Sometimes it involves a desperate grasping for affirmation. Sometimes it involves a gauzy nostalgia. Sometimes it involves a willful ignorance. All of these strains and others are woven into a larger and enduring narrative, the mythology of racial progress. Despite our tragic racial history, Americans generally believe that the country has made and continues to make steady progress toward racial equality. When we think about the nation's racial history, we often envision a linear path, one that admittedly begins in a shameful period but moves unerringly in a single direction toward equality. Unless people understand the systemic forces that create and sustain racial inequality, we will never successfully address it. And her language there about the linear path, that again is connected to what I referred to from Evelyn Hudahart as the triumphalist assumption. But here she's talking about this moment when George Floyd is murdered and people are looking for context, and they're going to The Help on Netflix, which was a fine film, right? But that's where they're going to learn, because we don't teach people enough. There's this term called political innumeracy, and it refers to unfamiliarity with politically relevant numbers. But just going back to what she was talking about and what we don't know, our misconceptions about where we are in terms of racial progress. Most Americans, regardless of their race, think that there are twice as many minorities in the United States as there are. 49% of Americans think the US is already a minority-majority country, where people of color, so to speak, outnumber people of European ancestry in the United States, people of white European ancestry, I should say, in the United States. We're not supposed to reach there until something like 2042 or 2045 or something like that, but people already think that's where we are. Most Americans believe the country's Muslim population is 17% larger than it is. And Americans are prone to exaggerate the size of the foreign-born population, and these misperceptions are linked to unfavorable views of immigration. I'm going to throw up just a little more data, and then I'm going to shut it down. But this is something I found interesting. It's a composite index of openness to diversity, and it just shows on this continuum which particular groups are more or less open to diversity. And I think that what you'll see is that is a correlation, a strong positive correlation between the folks who are most who are least open to diversity and who are also pushing back hardest against ethnic studies and against ideas of a more inclusive education in the United States. Again, continuing with people's misperceptions of where we are, the majority of white Americans think the average Black person is faring as well or better than the average white person. And this is just one data point, and I have another one that I'll show in just a second that shows median net worth. It's 2019, so before the bottom fell out in response to COVID, but median net worth for white families was almost $200,000, where for Black families was around $24,000, and Hispanic families a little bit higher, and other Obviously, there's a noticeable group here missing, which are, well, the two, they're Asian Americans who actually have a higher median net worth than any other group, understanding that there's vast diversity within Asian American populations, and Native Americans also aren't included here, and that's for different reasons. Here you have poverty rates by race and Hispanic origin. And again, to the point that we have gotten better. If you look at the African-American poverty rate in 1965, it was abysmal. Almost 40% of African-Americans lived in poverty. But to suggest that everything is okay and that we've completely closed the gap would be a fallacy. If you looked at 2019, the African-American poverty, the rate of African-Americans living in poverty was almost 19%, Hispanic Americans almost 16%. Whereas Asian and whites were down at 7.3%. So one of the things we look at a lot in the CSU now are equity gaps, and I think this is an example of something along those lines, an equity gap in terms of poverty. Last thing, well, second to last slide on this, just to again give you a sense of the work that we still have to do, and perhaps why more comprehensive education in terms of our past is important. National earnings disparity relative to white workers. This is from, I believe, last year. But if you know, there's a whole lot of data here. But if you just look at this last column, earnings per dollar. So with white being normative at $1, Black Americans earn 76 cents on white Americans' dollars, Native Americans 77, Asian Pacific Islanders 1.12, and Hispanic Latino 73 cents on the dollar, multiracial 81 cents on the white dollar. And the final slide here, data point, is unemployment by race and ethnicity. Again, unemployment is always pervasively higher, but just see this in chart form. You know, to look at you know, what always in May 2019, things weren't. This is some of the best unemployment numbers we've had for African Americans and Hispanic Americans and white Americans, Asian Americans as well. May 2020, obviously, this is when COVID-19 kicked in, and again, still the poverty rates for people of color are measurably higher than for white Americans. And that's not to disparage white Americans, simply to say that we still have some fundamental issues of inequality in this country. And it's important for us to kind of figure out where that comes from and not pretend that they don't exist. So finally, the point. We are unabashedly ignorant, particularly when it comes to issues of race. The ignorance impacts how we see the world and how we interact with each other. There was a sociologist by the name of Bob Blauner who wrote this great piece called Talking Past One Another. And he discussed how, because of all that we don't know about one another and the conversations we don't have and all of these misunderstandings, when we're talking about even issues of race and racism and racial discrimination, we're just not communicating. We're talking past each other. And finally, misinformed people often make misinformed decisions. And so I think that it's, you know, that the point of AB 1460 and AB 101, understanding that they are imperfect in their implementation, and there were things that if I were to write either law, I would have written differently. The point is that we need more information if we want to prepare, number one, our youth to kind of more adequately engage and competitively engage in a world that's increasingly diverse and interconnected. But number two, if we just want people to vote and to advocate for policies in a more responsible way, I think ensuring that they're properly educated about the real history of the United States in this case, and the real cultural contributions of different groups of people in the United States. I think that's something that's ultimately a good thing and only will help move us forward as a country. So with that, I shall stand down. That is the end of the slideshow, and I'll open it up to any comments.
Great. So let me thank you, Rafik. Thank you. That was excellent. I will open it up to any questions, either from the audience here or from our virtual online audience.
Andy had put a question in the chat.
Okay. Okay, let me see.
What is the origin of people's views? So we're on the right hand side.
Okay. Okay. Where does the origin of people's views of people come from, and why do some people seem susceptible to hating other people?
Ah, well, that's a that's a semester long answer, but I'll make it more succinct. You know, the ideas of difference. You know, we always find ways to differentiate between each other. I mean, that's kind of the nature of people, right? Yeah, I was having this conversation the other day about competition for resources in hunter-gatherer societies, right? And so, you know, the people's different views of people come from lots of different places, but ultimately, I would contend that they, again, going back to this idea of privilege, there are people who have disproportionate access to or share of resources, and they kind of generate narratives, ideologies around that justify their position, right? That justify their dominance, or that justify an economic need. So, for example, again, looking at that book, A Different Mirror, you know, Ram Takaki talks about the beginnings of the American colonies when in Jamestown in Virginia, for example, in the mid 1600s, you had a small Black enslaved labor force, a smaller, relatively speaking, working alongside white indentured servants from Europe. And they were all kind of doing the same thing. They were all kind of living and toiling in these conditions of oppression and slavery. And ultimately, as the tobacco economies began to really grow in Virginia and Maryland and North Carolina, and the need for exploitable labor increased, and as kind of awareness between indentured servants from Europe and enslaved Africans, they began to see themselves as kind of the same. Very deliberately, a legal wedge was driven between white indentured servants and enslaved Africans, and there was this whole ideological structure of superiority and inferiority that was kind of created around them to justify the continued enslavement of Africans and essentially the work to freedom for the white indentured servants from Europe. So it comes from a lot of places, but ultimately, you know, they come from, I mean, you know, we construct narratives around difference all the time. People who seem different from us, we tend to think negatively about them. But some of these ideas of who is what and hating other people have deep historical roots that are ultimately, again, looking at the debasement of Africans and enslavement. They go back to the 1400s and the 1500s, when Europeans began to come into closer contact with Africans through trade routes, and it was convenient to kind of cast them as inferior. They weren't Christian. So there was this idea of heathens and infidels, and you saw that also in Latin America with Columbus and others who came to Latin America and began to, or Central, the Caribbean and Latin America, and saw anyone who wasn't like them as inferior, and developed these stories around them as savages and cannibals and things like that. So it's got a long history. It was kind of a windy answer, but a long history. In terms of why we hate each other, I don't know. I really wish that weren't the case, but you know, I wish folks would get out more. You know, one of the things that President Morales and I share in common is our belief that, for example, our students going abroad is something that is critical. It's one of the most transformational things that they can do, because they leave home and they see the world through the perspective of other people, and they meet other people who, when you get there, you think that they're different from you, and you realize that you do have a shared humanity. You're all people. And the more we interact with people who we perceive to be different from us, I think the more we understand that we needn't hate someone just because they look different, speak a different language or something like that, that in fact, we're all kind of the same.
Just thank you, Rafik. Unmute yourself if you have a question. Just speak up. We have about 4 more minutes before we need to break for service, but please.
I could just say one more thing.
Yes, please. Go
Sure.
ahead.
So So one of the things that came up, you mentioned in the earlier on, President Morales, and that's come up a lot is critical race theory. and I figure, most folks here have already kind of explored what critical race theory is and isn't. But just so one of there have been all these laws that have passed, kind of banning critical race theory in K through 12 and all these states and things like that. Number one, ethnic studies and critical race theories are different. I think critical race theory could be under the umbrella of ethnic studies, generally speaking, but it's far more specific. Critical race theory is something that's generally speaking only taught in law schools or graduate programs that focus on law. And it looks at legal structures and legal institutions and the role that they have historically played in perpetuating systemic racism and oppressing other groups on the basis of race and class and gender and things like that. But so that's at the core of critical race theory. It's not something that's designed to vilify the United States, but merely point out the places in our past where the law has played a role in subjugating people on the basis of race. And an easy example, there's this really cool story written by this guy, Derek Bell, who was one of the pioneers of critical race theory, called The Chronicle of the Space Traders, where he talks about aliens who come to the United States or come to the Earth, and they offer the United States a trade, basically for all of its Black people. They are willing to give a chemical that cleans up the environment, an energy source that doesn't pollute, and money to buy out the deficit, right? So essentially we'll have no more debt. And all we have to give them in exchange is all the Black people, right? And what he does in this piece, obviously that's this fantastic story, right? But what he does in the piece is he goes back and looks at all of the Supreme Court decisions historically and legislative decisions, legislative acts where we have done things that create a precedent for something like this to actually happen, right? And so again, going back to what I was talking about with respect to Korematsu versus United States and the internment of Japanese people of Japanese ancestry, again, 70% of whom were Americans by birth. You look at post-September 11th and the Muslim registries that were proposed and, kind of internment by suspicion and things like that in the interest of national security. And these things have happened in the past, and Korematsu was never overturned. It's still precedent. So stare decisis is something that could still prevail in those cases. So critical race theory is not ethnic studies. Critical race theory looks very specifically at legal structures and legal institutions and the role that they have played in perpetuating racial inequality, and then proposing some of the solutions to kind of moving beyond that.
Thank you again. We hear the call, and so Rafik, thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure, and thank you all, and have a wonderful Sunday.
Great.